When I finished medical school, I was in awe of the doctors at Ivy League institutions like Harvard. They were supposed to be the smartest and most ethical minds in medicine, the ones you trust with the most complicated cases and the sickest patients. But 10 years later, I see things differently. In fact, I sometimes wince when someone tells me they're getting their care at one of these prestigious centers. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Many Ivy League doctors have swallowed pharmaceutical propaganda more deeply than anyone else in medicine. And as a result, they've become some of the most misinformed prescribers when it comes to the true safety and effectiveness of the medications they recommend, which frankly is the most important thing to understand if your job is to prescribe drugs. Now, I know this sounds crazy, right? After all, these are supposed to be the experts, but they're not. And understanding why this contradiction exists is critical if you're thinking about placing your trust and your health in the hands of these institutions. So let's unpack what's gone so wrong. And quickly, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, so I know what's going on from the inside out. So let's begin. Well, most people know that drug companies invest billions into marketing, but what they often miss is this, and that is that the real target of marketing isn't you, it's in fact the doctors that treat you. And the doctors most heavily targeted by this marketing, well, it's the ones who are working at the academic medical centers. And so today we're going to dive into how these once respected institutions lost their independence and how the doctors there became some of the pharmaceutical industry's most effective sales reps. So one of the biggest problems I see today is this, and that is that many professors at top medical schools are putting career advancement ahead of telling the truth about the medications they prescribe. And most people think that doctors would never do this because after all, elite institutions are going to be choosing their doctors based on their ethics and their commitment to helping patients. But after 4 years in academic medical centers and 2 years in the pharmaceutical industry, I've learned that that's simply not how the world works. Because the reality is that universities often select and reward doctors not for their clinical wisdom, but for their ability to bring in research grants. These grants are what keeps the lights on at these facilities. It supports staff salaries, and it also elevates the prestige of the institution by being cutting edge and involved in research. And the easiest ways for doctors to essentially make it rain, that is to get lots of these research grants, is to engage in pharmaceutical-sponsored research. And why is this? Well, it's because drug companies make it so easy. When you help drug companies run their clinical trials, they will write the protocols for you, they will provide the staff, they will crunch the numbers for you, they will write the manuscript to drafts for you, and then they will handle all of the publishing. On top of that, they'll even fly you around the world to talk about their drugs at different conferences. And now if you're a doctor who wants to rise through the academic ranks, running these types of studies becomes the fastest and most rewarded path to get a professorship, because the way they promote people is based on the number of publications they have and whether they're seen as an international expert. And that means flying around the world and talking. And so that's why when you look at the head professors at almost all academic medical centers, almost all of them have been heavily involved in running clinical trials for drug companies. But you might be thinking, well, so what? Someone's got to run these studies and these guys specialize in research. Isn't this part of science? Well, there's actually a pretty big problem with this. And the problem comes down to the fact that pharmaceutical companies are not in the business of telling the absolute truth about medications. They're in the business of selling pharmaceuticals. And their goal is to make their drug look better than the competition, no matter how small the edge is. Most people forget that when a drug comes onto the market, it's usually competing against 5 other drugs, and any advantage they can get over the other drug can lead to millions, if not billions, in sales. And what this often means is that these companies need to hype the benefits of their drug while downplaying the risks. And they do all of this within the boundaries of what they can legally get away with, like literally within an inch of that. And because of this, the doctors who want to advance quickly in their careers realize that they are under immense pressure with going along with this pro-drug narrative if they want to get ahead. Because what happens when doctors start to speak out against this? What happens if a doctor says, well, hey, I'm really not comfortable with what you've written in this manuscript here. I think we're overstating the benefit. Or, hey, I'm really not comfortable with you calling this drug well tolerated because we've had a lot of serious adverse side effects. Well, what happens next? Well, the invitations to participate in their clinical research stop, and you are quietly excluded from future studies. And you will suddenly start to watch your peers pull ahead of you with more funding and more publications and more promotions, while you get left behind. And I've heard this firsthand from several doctors who have confided to me that after they started speaking out about problems with medications, this was essentially career suicide. They were cut out. And so here's the bottom line. Most academic doctors are put in a position where they have to choose between the absolute truth or the, the relative truth, the filtered truth, the least amount of truth they can get away with while still being legally compliant, and their career. So most of them will choose their career and going along with the relative truth. And this can create a massive psychological tension because no one would want to admit that they've essentially become a shill for the drug company. And so instead they just start going along with the version of relative truth that the drug company is promoting. And that is how good people at these academic medical centers, and most of them are good people, this is how they slowly lose their objectivity about the drugs and they become blind to the kind of damage and misinformation that they are enabling. And this has huge ripple effects to the people who are underneath them in their organization. Because when these professors teach the next generation of doctors, they're going to pass on their drug-friendly, pharma-aligned worldview. And that is not what you want in a doctor. Because you really want someone who is going to tell you the absolute truth about a drug, even when it costs them. You want someone whose loyalty is first to you and not their next promotion. But I have to tell you, the problems do not stop there. Because even well-meaning clinicians in these institutions, that is, not the researchers engaged in the clinical trial research, can be hugely influenced as well. And it's not because they're chasing career advancement, but it's because they do not realize all of the subtle ways that they're being marketed to. And I have to say this with a little bit of humility, because before I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, I was completely unaware of all of the methods that these companies use to influence doctors. And for a long time, I believed that pharmaceutical companies, their main marketing strategy was just what everyone sees, TV ads, adverts in glossy magazines, and maybe a good-looking sales rep that would bring sandwiches to the office or invite you out for a dinner. But I have to tell you, these are just distractions, they're red herrings, they're decoys. Because the real game is to market to a doctor without them even realizing it's happening. And the drug companies have become so good at this that most doctors, even those who consider themselves deeply objective, are unaware that they've been completely influenced to simply drink the drug company Kool-Aid. So let's talk about some of the hidden ways pharma shapes your doctor's thinking. Well, I think it comes down to two big tactics that they use. And the first is ghostwriting. So one of the most effective ways drug companies shape medical opinion is by creating the illusion of expert consensus. Let's say, for instance, there's a concern that an antidepressant could cause suicidal thoughts. This was a very real concern in the early 90s. Well, the best way, if you were a drug company like Eli Lilly and you just put Prozac on the market and you're making billions, the best ways to allay concern in the medical community would be to get a group of experts to essentially say that the evidence isn't compelling, that there's a lot of doubt in there. There's actually a remarkably simple way for drug companies to do just that, and that's called ghostwriting. And this is when a pharmaceutical company's internal team or like a media relations company that they hire will draft an entire research paper or a position paper on a controversial topic, and then they go and invite academic doctors. Oftentimes, these are the doctors who are already running the clinical studies for the companies, or they have some kind of consulting arrangement with them. And so they're already very pharma friendly. So they will invite these doctors to contribute to their paper. But the reality is that these academics will often add little to nothing to these articles, but they're happy to be listed as authors because it's essentially a free publication for them that they don't have to write on a high profile topic, and it further boosts their CV. And they're doing it with all of their peers. And there's power in numbers. If you're doing it with all of these different academics from different places, it's very hard for you to be singled out and criticized. The real authors are actually pharmaceutical company employees, or they're like contractors to the drug company. And the listed authors, who are the academics from these big name institutions, are essentially a front. And so it looks like it's coming from the academics, but it's really not. And it's so easy for drug companies to create a lot of these publications because they have big internal teams for publications that manage the submissions to all the high impact journals. They do the peer review responses, and they make sure that the piece gets published. All of this takes a lot of time and money. And the ultimate result of this is that there is literally a flood of pro-drug articles that appear to come from independent experts at prestigious institutions that are clogging up the medical literature. This is one of the biggest frauds in medicine these days. that many doctors believe that medical journals are independent, when so much of the content in there actually has a marketing agenda targeted towards doctors. And what this means is that when you have curious, well-meaning doctors out there in, the academic centers or the communities, and they want to search the literature for answers on real issues with drugs that are troubling their patients, what do they find? They find paper after paper promoting a drug-friendly message written by leaders in their field and published in top journals. But this is just a carefully constructed mirage. It's essentially laundering drug company marketing through prestigious doctors at academic centers and medical journals. And this isn't rare because it's been explicitly documented in lawsuits such as Pfizer's Zoloft litigation in the early 2000s, where this practice was so brazen, they had authorship lines that were literally marked with TBD, to be determined. They had multiple publications which were written, and they were shopping around for doctors to put on the authorship line to essentially use their credibility to influence other doctors. But I do want to say I'm thankful that there has been some improvement with ghostwriting, because after multiple scandals about this, many journals now require disclosure of quote-unquote editorial assistance, which is essentially drug companies drafting the entire manuscript. They require that to be disclosed by authors. But oftentimes this is usually just like buried in the fine print, and most doctors do not read it. And I just want to, I want to emphasize here that the effects of ghostwriting have been so widespread, and this is why, and I'll speak to psychiatry here, there's so many things that still live on for this. For instance, that there's this idea that that antidepressants causing suicidal behavior in some people is still controversial when the evidence is indisputable. And this is, again, drug company marketing. And there's also this idea that antidepressant withdrawal is mild and lasts a couple weeks. Again, a lot of this stuff came out of consensus groups and articles written by drug companies and then laundered through academics. So now let's move on to the next way that doctors can be unknowingly manipulated by drug company messaging. And that is the way that they control the national media. And so let's say, for instance, there is a growing concern about antidepressant withdrawal. Something like this could frighten both doctors and patients. Doctors wouldn't want to prescribe someone a medication that would cause horrific withdrawal when they come off, and patients would probably want to avoid that. And so wouldn't it be great if the national media downplayed this issue? Well, it turns out there's an easy way of doing that. And that is when you can get pharmaceutical companies to fund press organizations that can manage this narrative for them. And so generally what they do is they hire, PR firms or press agencies to help them with this. And what these companies do is they will line up rebuttals from drug-friendly academics who they work with. They will pitch these rebuttals to news outlets around the clock, and they will ensure that everyone stays on the same talking points. And, again, I'll speak to psychiatry because that's where I am. And usually the talking points are, this concern is overblown, the critics are dangerous, they're scaring people away from treatment, mental illness is underdiagnosed and heavily stigmatized, and that the psych drugs are safe and effective. And they will just hammer those points again and again and again. And this helps them control the narrative. And a great example of one of these groups that many drug companies use is the Science Media Center. So let's have a look at them. Well, as you can see on their homepage, they're marketed as an independent press office, helping to ensure that the public have access to the best scientific evidence and expertise through the news media when science hits the headlines. Well, guys, let's see about that. Let's have a look at the funding that they receive. And so when you look at the funding, you can see that they receive tens of thousands of dollars from different drug companies. So we got like GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Moderna, Merck, Abbott, and it goes on and on. And so let me ask you this. Do you think this company is going to be completely independent when most of their funding is coming from drug companies? No, they're going to have a pharma-friendly tilt. And you see this play out in the way that they try and combat stories that are critical about medications. And one such example was their response to an article by Mark Horowitz and Joanna Moncrief, who are researchers in the UK who started talking about the frequency of antidepressant withdrawal. They were saying that, 70% of people, if they've been on these medications for over 2 years, they will go into withdrawal. 15% of these people will have severe withdrawal, which is very accurate. And that's really what I see. And that's not surprising for a lot of people. But what they've gone and done is they've gone and collected a whole series of quotes from different academics who are more drug friendly, to essentially shoot down these studies. This type of study is highly susceptible to bias. And then they go out and they pitch them to news outlets to essentially persuade people that these articles are nothing to be concerned about. And the effect that this has is massive, because when you start to have numerous articles which are shooting down concerns and they're in major media outlets, they will create the illusion of a public consensus about a topic, and they are going to drown out dissent, even if that dissent is true, even if the criticism is true. Because honestly, it is very hard for independent people who criticize power to compete when drug companies have multiple media companies working around the clock to help them promote their narrative. Which is why, if you like content like this, and if you believe in what I do on this channel, please consider sharing the content, liking, subscribing, because I don't have a media company that's on retainer. And if you believe this type of information is useful to the public, when you support me in those ways, it helps push it out to a greater number of people and helps it be seen. So thank you for that, and moving on. So why do these strategies work so well, especially on doctors? Well, it's because most doctors, they're in the clinic, they're seeing 4 patients an hour, and they do not have time to rigorously analyze data on every controversial topic that comes up, or to trace the funding sources, or to look at the fine print in the different journal articles to look for, different types of biases. And so what they rely on is, one, what do the experts say? And what is published in prestigious medical journals? And what does the national media outlets report? And historically, it has always been a very rational strategy to simply trust authority when making sense of complicated issues you don't have time to dig into, because those authorities are there because usually they're trustworthy. But the problem is that these authorities have now become compromised, especially when it comes to wanting to learn the absolute truth about drugs. And sadly, it is the academic doctors at these big name institutions who I often see to be the most deeply influenced. And why is this? Well, after all, their mentors were groomed by Pharma. These are the people who are running the clinical studies. All of the other ones that don't put up with that, they have left. And so you get a concentrated group of doctors who are very pro-Pharma in these institutions. These doctors at these academic centers, they're more likely to be reading the medical journals and to believe in it because there is a culture there that really values medical journals and the academic literature. And finally, and this is completely normal for a lot of people to have a little bit of this, is that there can be some institutional arrogance. Because if you're in Harvard, that's something to be proud of. If you're in Stanford, or if you're in one of these elite institutions, your facilities, they generate research. They're looked to lead public trust and things like that. And so you want to believe in what your doctors are saying, and you want to believe in the medical literature, because in some ways you just think you know better than other people because you're in these places and you believe in these things. And that can sometimes make people less likely to want to listen to their patients and learn new things. They simply believe that they know. And I hear these stories every day from my patients, and it's heartbreaking. I have so many patients who go and get their medical care at Stanford. And if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that a Stanford doctor rapidly pulled them off medications because they said withdrawal was mild and self-limited, I have a lot of nickels right now. And this is a story I hear again and again and again. So what I want to say is that it took me 10 years to see this clearly. And this is really why I don't trust doctors at these Ivy League and top institutions anywhere near the way I used to. Yes, there are some doctors there who are great, but there are a lot of doctors there who are just terrible because of the issues I've mentioned in this video. And so what I want to ask you to do, if this message resonated with you, is to share your experience in the comments below. Have you ever been let down by a doctor from one of these top institutions? If so, please let me know what happened. Next, if you want to see how marketing has misled a lot of people about psychiatry, I'd highly recommend you watch this next video where I go over 20 brutally honest truths about psychiatry that have been hidden from you.